Hey everyone,
Hey guys.
welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're going to be recapping our trip that we just got back from, our around the world trip, and also talking about some tips for international travel. We have traveled a lot internationally over the last 4 or 5 years. I was just adding it up and we're almost at a year and a half of international travel since 2018. So during that time we've learned a ton, and we get questions pretty often about the trips that we take and any advice that we have for other people that want to take long trips. So in the future we'll be able to point them to this video. So basically we're going to go through some of the trips we've done. Whitney's outline on this video was extremely long, so some of this will have to be a little more brief. Some of the sections that she wrote here, but we'll give an outline of what we've done, what we've learned over time, answer any questions that you guys have, and hopefully give you some insight if you want to take longer trips in the future. So Whitney's going to introduce us, and I'm going to get this video shared in a few different groups.
All right. Hey everyone. For those that may not know us, my name is Whitney Aiken.
I'm Jared Kazazza.
And we're both traveling doctors of physical therapy. Many of you guys may know us as the faces behind the Travel Therapy Mentor page. We've been traveling physical therapists for over 7 years now. We both started in 2015 when we were new grads. And as a little bit more in-depth background about us that'll lead well into this topic, we worked full-time as travel PTs for our first 3 years. From 2015 through 2018, we were taking back-to-back travel contracts, working like a pretty typical travel therapist, only taking a week off here and there between jobs. And our focus those first 3 years was really saving as much as possible. And for any of you guys who have followed our page for any length of time, or maybe for those of you who even knew us before Travel Therapy Mentor, when we had our original blog, which was called Fifth Wheel Physical Therapist, you guys may already know that Jared is really into finance. One of our biggest goals with travel healthcare was to be able to save as much as possible and get ourselves into a good financial position so that we would have more options to transition to semi-retirement, to not have to work full-time, to be able to just have more options financially. So after our first 3 years of traveling full-time, we had saved up a lot, met a lot of our financial goals, and we decided to take a little bit of time off to travel abroad and travel internationally. And what started as planning like a 1 month or 2 month trip off, which for us at the time was totally radical. We'd never really known anybody that had taken like a couple months off of work. We'd never done that before. But it quickly blossomed into this 5-month trip where we traveled all around the world. We took like basically half the year off and traveled. And that was really such a pivotal time in our lives that just changed our whole trajectory. You know, we were planning on still working full time for a couple more years after that, continuing to save, but things really changed after that trip for us. So we'll talk in more detail about that, but that's a little bit of background about who we are for those of you guys that may not be familiar with our story. Thank you guys that are tuning in live on Facebook tonight. If you are watching live, we would love if you'd say hello in the comments. Let us know if you're somebody who's been watching our videos for a long time. Are you a new follower? Are you a current traveler? Are you somebody who's thinking about getting into travel? Who knows, maybe there's even some of you guys that are tuning in tonight that aren't even related to travel healthcare. You just want to know more about international travel. We'd love if you'd say hi in the comments. Also, we know a lot of you guys will watch later. So if you watch later on Facebook, you can type replay in the comments. I know a lot of you guys will also listen later on the podcast as well. So shout out to you guys. Yeah,
before we get too far into the video, quick reminder that we're doing our giveaways, end of the year giveaways in just a few days. So we're not going to go through all what the giveaways are again on this video, but we've talked about in the last few videos. If you have any question about whether you qualify or not, go back and watch the very first few minutes of the last few videos. But we're doing that at the end of the year, and so that'll be exciting. Probably on the 31st or the 1st, we'll announce all the giveaway winners. So final call for anybody that wants to get in the running for those.
Yeah, and if you're on our email list, you'll see the reminder about the giveaways there too.
All right.
So just to kind of pick up where I left off, talking about a little bit of our background. In 2018, we started planning our first international trip, and at this time, neither of us had ever really traveled internationally before. We took like a trip to the Bahamas on a cruise, and I think I had been to Italy once with like a student group when I was in college. And besides that, neither of us had ever really traveled internationally before.
Yeah, so it was all brand new to us. I also, at the time, like Whitney said, was very into finance. So a big focus of that trip was to travel inexpensively, because I wanted to basically prove to myself, Whitney as well, that we could do these long international trips and not spend so much money that it was not feasible. I kind of had the idea that maybe these type of trips would become a common thing for us. We'd be able to see a lot more of the world. But I wanted it to be reasonably priced so that we could afford to do it.
Yeah, and at this time, Jared had gotten a lot of inspiration just from reading different bloggers and people that were more in like the financial independence space. We didn't really know any other travel therapists or travel healthcare folks that had done these kinds of trips. So he was just getting some ideas from other financial independence bloggers, and he was trying to say like, well, maybe we could make what they're doing work for our situation because we have flexible jobs. Because as travel therapists or travel nurses, you can work a contract and then take time off. So as long as you are frugal and financially savvy and save up your money, you can get the time off, whereas most people that have a traditional 9-to-5 job can't really get multiple months off, right? So that's the biggest hurdle, is you can get the time off. The second thing is you can save a lot more money as a travel therapist or travel nurse compared to someone at a permanent job because you make so much more as a traveler.
I really think that's why it's ideal as a traveler to do these types of long trips, because most of the people that I was getting inspiration from were people that had like retired and then they were traveling, doing long trips at that point, which is great and everything, but a lot of these people are older and it's a little harder to travel when you're older. So I wanted to make that work for us being young. We were in our late 20s at that time, and travel healthcare is perfect for that, because what we figured out is if we work 6 months a year as travelers, we can make very close to the same amount of money after tax as we would if we worked a full-time permanent job. So that means that if we work 6 months, we basically cover our income for the whole year and we can take the rest of that time off. So that's the ideal situation. And if we can travel pretty frugally, we can save money during that 6-month period, and we can use credit card rewards, things like that to save on costs, then we could indefinitely do these like 6 months on, 6 months off. And that's what we started calling semi-retirement.
Yep. So after our first trip in 2018, we traveled for 5 months. We went all over Asia and a little bit of Europe. That went really well. And so we were like, you know what? I think this is just going to be our life from now on. So we're going to come back, work a contract or two, and then take off on another trip. So we did. We came back, worked one contract in 2019, and then we took off on another international trip. This time we went for 4 months, and we went all over Europe and saw most of Eastern and Western Europe at that time. And then we came back, worked another contract, and then we were planning on doing the same thing again in 2020. We had a whole 5-month trip planned to Latin America, Central, South America, and Mexico at that time. And unfortunately, because of COVID, our 2020 Latin America trip had to be canceled.
Yeah, and the weirdest thing about that trip, I think about it now, 2018, when we were planning the trip around the world, that was like so exciting because it was completely brand new. I'd only spent 1 week out of the country my entire life. So to think about spending 5 months traveling to all these places that I looked at as so exotic was like the most exciting thing I could think of. So I spent probably 100 hours planning this trip and reading about things and stuff we could do and where we could go. And that was so awesome. And then the trip in 2019 to Europe, there was so much I wanted to see in Europe, and there's so much history there. And planning that trip, we spent so much time on it. The trip in 2020, it was so weird because it kind of felt like it wasn't going to happen. And I remember thinking about that before anything ever happened with COVID or any of that. But I just was not really into the planning like I used to be. And I remember thinking about like, okay, we could go here, and how much of the ticket's going to be from here to here. Part of that, I now think back on it, was because it was a lot more expensive. It's difficult to get around in Central South America like it is in Europe and Asia. It's more expensive for flights. The distances are farther a lot of times. So I think that was part of the reason, because it wasn't going to be as inexpensive as I wanted it to be. But for whatever reason, it was just very weird that it just seemed like it wasn't going to happen.
It felt a little bit rushed. I remember feeling like we weren't quite ready to leave, but we were like, well, we need to leave at this time because the timing will just work out better. But it almost like we felt a little bit tired. Like we kind of needed to like go home instead for a month and like have a break. So it's kind of ironic that it ended up getting canceled because it was like, well, now we get a whole year of a break with COVID not being able to travel.
Yeah, and at the time that was a major nightmare because we had 2.5 to 3 months of the trip completely booked. Flights, hotels, Airbnbs, everything booked. And it got canceled about 1 day before we were going to leave. We had our bags packed and everything, and we had to cancel that entire 5-month trip. So that was a nightmare at the time, but now looking back, just for whatever reason, it didn't seem like it was going to happen anyway. So it was not ideal, but we replanned part of the trip, and we'll probably finish the rest of the trip in the future, and it all worked out okay.
Yeah, so in 2021, once things kind of settled down a little bit with COVID and international travel became a little bit more feasible, we went to Mexico for about 8 weeks and traveled around different parts of Mexico. So that was replanning part of our Latin America trip. And then in 2022, earlier this year, we went for about 10 weeks. Was that yeah, it was in spring. About 10 weeks to some other parts of Latin America. So we haven't quite made it to all the places that we had planned to go in 2020 to Latin America, but we've done a couple smaller trips, like 2-month trips, where we actually ended up spending a little more time, because we spent way more time in Mexico than we originally had planned, but that was really good because it was kind of just like a more of a relaxing, chill kind of trip, our Mexico trip. And then we went to Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica, and Guatemala as well.
Yeah. And then in the middle of this year, when we drove to Alaska, we spent quite a bit of time driving all around Canada, probably 2 or 3 weeks in total. So we saw a ton of Canada, most of Canada. And then we just got back from our 9-week trip around the world, traveling to, well, we'll highlight all the stops, but it was a 9-week trip and it was one of our favorites so far. So we've done a lot of international travel, over 40 countries now, which is pretty crazy. And yeah, we still have a lot of things we want to see. It's so funny because people will send us messages and they'll be like, you guys have seen so much, I would love to do that, but we always feel like we haven't seen very much, because the more you travel, the more you find things that you want to do.
Yeah, we meet these other travelers because it's a lot more common for people that are from Europe and Australia, New Zealand. Like, these kinds of folks tend to travel more than Americans for whatever reason, especially Europe, because it's really easy to hop around to different countries in Europe, and a lot of them tend to take more like gap years. So we'll meet all these other people and they'll be like, oh, that's cool, you travel, have you been to this place? Well, no. Have you been to this place? No. And we're like, there's all these places they keep mentioning that we haven't even been yet, but we've traveled a lot. For most people, we've been to 42 countries, and as Jared said, we spent more than 1.5 years of our lives abroad, only within the last 5 years. So just a little bit of background about us, and kind of leading up to telling you more about this trip and telling you more about some of the strategies that we've used. Leave us a comment. I see more of you guys are kind of hopping on live. Leave us a comment if this is something that you are interested in doing, if you want to learn how to travel internationally more often and for longer periods. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and we'll get more into this later on as well, but something else that's, I guess, important to mention is our whole philosophy on how we plan trips and everything has kind of shifted since COVID, because of that 2020 trip that got canceled, and it was a major hassle canceling all the flights, and a lot of it wasn't refunded. We lost a lot of money on that. So now our more recent trips, the one to Central and South America and the one we just got back from, it's way more spur of the moment. And in 2018, we would have never done something like that. It was like 2018, we had the entire outline of the trip planned before we ever left. And we had the first like 2 or 2.5 months booked before we left. The flights, hotels, buses, everything. This trip, a lot of cases, we were booking it like less than a week in advance. So our philosophy has changed, and there's situations where both of those make sense, and I think when you have a little bit more flexibility and more money, it's a lot easier to plan as you go, whereas early on we had limited money and kind of limited flexibility, so we booked it way more in advance.
Yeah, I think the other important thing I want to just mention for those of you guys that may not know, we get the question quite often, do we work internationally? And we do not work as physical therapists internationally. So all of these trips are just for leisure. We're just traveling for fun. We're not working as therapists while we're abroad. Now, because we now have our online business, we do work online while we're on our trips. But like when we took our first trip in 2018, at that time, all we had was our blog, and it wasn't really work so much. We would write some articles here and there, but it wasn't really an online business at that point. Yeah. But yeah, we don't work as therapists while we're abroad.
So to quickly recap the trip that we just got back from, I know that probably a lot of you guys watching this or listening on the podcast, you probably already follow us on Instagram and you've seen nothing but pictures and stories about the trip that we just finished. So you probably know a lot of the places we went. But just real quick, we started in Greece. That was all we had booked pretty much when we left, was just Greece. We went to Santorini, Naxos, two of the islands in Greece. There's a ton of islands. And then Athens. And then from there we went to Egypt. Egypt was amazing. From Egypt we went to Dubai to Singapore to Australia. We went to Sydney, Cairns, Brisbane, and then we flew to American Samoa to check off one of the national parks there. That was an amazing stop. And then from American Samoa, we came back to New Zealand. New Zealand, we went all around the country for about 2.5 weeks. We rented a car and did a road trip all around New Zealand. And then we flew home from Auckland.
Yep. So this trip might seem kind of random because those are a bunch of different countries on 4 different continents. And it is a little bit random because when we originally started planning the trip several months before we left, all we did was we booked a flight to Greece. And we booked a flight to Greece thinking that we were going to do a trip around Europe. But then we just kind of had that flight sitting there for like a month or two. And then we were like, oh, we should probably like decide where we're going to go. And then as we started talking about it some more, we decided that maybe instead of doing more of Europe, we should do something a little more ambitious and go further away to places that we may not be able to go as easily once we have kids, which could be happening in the next couple of years. So we decided instead that we should try to go to Australia and New Zealand, but we already had a flight booked, the direction going to Greece, going west, going east. And so we were like, well, it's going to be kind of a long flight to get from Greece to Australia. So we decided to pick up a couple of neat places in between just to like break up the travel more or less. So we randomly were like, we'd love to see the pyramids. Let's go to Egypt. And then we were like, where else could we go that we'd love to go? And we were like, Dubai would be a cool place to see. And then we just were looking at Google Flights at what was a good stopover between Dubai and Australia, and we landed on Singapore, and that's how we ended up in Singapore.
Yeah, and that kind of goes to what we were talking about, how our philosophy of planning trips has changed now, because in the past we would have never done that. We would have been planning the trip basically based on cost and where the cheapest flights were and things like that, and now we don't care as much about that. Of course, it's always a concern, but we mainly want to go to places that we really want to visit nowadays, and it's less about the money.
Yeah. And so, part of like adding those stops in the middle was just to make it more convenient and not have to have as long of flights. And that's kind of how we did our first trip in 2018. We wanted to ultimately go to Asia, but we were like, it's going to be a really long flight to get to Asia. Why don't we do a couple stops in Europe on the way just to break up the flights? And that's how we ended up doing some Europe and some Asia that year. There's a lot of strategy that goes into planning a longer trip. So we're going to get into talking more about that.
Yeah. So, like we a little bit mentioned earlier, longer trips are pretty much possible, not for many people. Unless you're retired or you have an extremely flexible job like we do, you can't really take 1, 2, 3, 4 months off unless you're working or you live in somewhere like New Zealand or Europe where those things are more common. In the US, that's just not really a common thing. You usually have 2 or 3 weeks of vacation, and there's no way that you're going to be able to take a month or 2 months off. So for probably 90% of the population, it's crazy to even think about taking a month or 2 months off because you'd lose your job and you'd have to start over when you get back. But for us in travel healthcare, it's completely feasible. So since it's feasible, I think it's something that everyone should at least consider. And on that note, most people take 1 or 2 week trips internationally. So they might go to Europe, and it's like a whirlwind trip where they're going to like London, Paris, maybe like Amsterdam, and then they fly back. And it's like action-packed, and you're tired when you get home, and then you go back to work. And we like to try to plan our trips with a little bit more leisure in there so we're not so exhausted. And international travel in general is kind of exhausting. You're moving around a lot, you're changing beds, you're sometimes not getting ideal sleep. But if you can plan a little bit more time, it can be a lot more enjoyable. You can see more, you give yourself time for spontaneity, because a lot of our trips, the coolest things we see are not things that we plan to see. It'll just be something that kind of pops up, which is awesome. And if you have everything like really laid out to the minute, that's not going to happen. So part of the spontaneity of international travel is one of our favorite things. And then the other thing with international travel is when you take those short trips, a lot of times on your trips, the flights are one of the biggest costs. So if you take a 2-week trip, your costs for flights are the same as if you took a 5-month trip, right? You have to fly there and you have to fly back. At least the beginning and ending flights are the same. If you can spread your trip out over 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, instead of just a week or two, it spreads that cost of those big major flights over a longer period of time. So on a daily or weekly basis, you spend less money traveling for longer term. And that sounds counterintuitive, but when you think about how those big expenses are kind of centralized, I guess, in most of those flights, then it makes more sense.
Yeah, like if you were planning on seeing the same number of places but in separate trips, like if you just had a typical job where you could only take a week here and a week there, so you take 1 week this first 3 months of the year and you fly all the way to Europe and back, and then you take 1 week in the second half of the year and you fly all the way to Asia and back. Well, now you've spent like double the amount on flights, whereas if you could have just stayed for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks all together, you could have, skipped to one of those round trip flights, right?
Yeah. So, and that kind of goes with, you need to be strategic about places that you're going, especially if you're trying to save money, like was our main goal in 2018, 2019. We wanted to see awesome things. We wanted to see the world, but we also wanted to do it at a reasonable cost so that we could continue to do these things. It wasn't just going to be a one-time trip of a lifetime type thing. We wanted it to be like an every year thing where we got to go travel, see the world before we had to settle down. So to do that, you need to be pretty strategic with how you plan, how you budget, and we'll give you some tips on that.
Yeah, I feel like we kind of really skipped over the recap of our trip, which, I mean, I don't want to go into too great detail, but I just want to circle back really quick and just tell you a little bit more about our trip that we just went on. So Greece was amazing. It was so funny. We loved Greece. And toward the end of Greece, we were like, why didn't we come here sooner? It's like, oh, Greece is amazing. Who knew? Oh, wait, everyone knew. We just kind of like skipped Greece. I don't know why in our Europe trip, but we were like, wow, like Greece is definitely all it's hyped up to be. The islands were amazing, beautiful, food is delicious. It's actually like pretty cheap compared to a lot of Europe. So loved Greece. The islands were amazing. We'd love to go back and do more of the islands. Naxos actually ended up being like one of our favorites. It was like way more chill. We'd never even heard of it before. Obviously Santorini is very well known, very wonderful there. And then it was really cool to be in Athens and just learn more about the history there. Phenomenal.
I can tell you the reason we skipped Greece in the past is most of our trips prior to this in Europe were Western Europe, Central Europe, but Greece is pretty far east and Eastern Europe, and it never really made sense to go out of our way down to Greece. And we also thought it was pretty expensive, which we were wrong about. It's actually very affordable, especially compared to anywhere in Western Europe.
Yeah, I mean, especially too, like we're going to talk about, if you can get a cheaper flight using points or, you know, just strategizing with your flight, then once you get there, it's actually really affordable. So can't recommend Greece enough. It was amazing.
It's definitely in our probably top 3 countries out of 40 some. So
yeah, we loved it. Definitely, like, we're addicted to Greek salads while we were there. It was so good. After that, Egypt was phenomenal. Egypt was way better than what we thought it was going to be. I was definitely more scared to go to Egypt. Now they definitely do have some turmoil there. We felt pretty safe the whole time that we were there, but we were definitely in like the more touristy areas. But they definitely have had some political unrest, and what did they have? They had a revolution. It's possible they could go into another revolution because things are not good economically there. But if you can go anytime soon while things are not so bad, obviously exploring the ancient Egypt stuff was just amazing. And just, you know, you can't even imagine.
Growing up and learning about it in history, I mean, you know, it's going to be amazing, but it's seeing in person is even more amazing than we could have anticipated. And
just trying to figure out the wonders of how they built those pyramids, we'll never know. So that was amazing. Dubai and Singapore were all right. I mean, they were cool, big cities. Like, we're not really big city people, but to see it for a few days each, amazing. I mean, they have some of the biggest buildings and the most record-setting things in the world in Dubai, the tallest building in the world. That was pretty cool.
Also, 2 of the safest areas in the whole world. Singapore is always on the top of the list, and Dubai, I mean, there's people that say there's zero crime there. There's not zero crime, but there's extremely, extremely low levels of crime.
Yeah, so those are 2 pretty interesting cities. Definitely glad that we visited them. Funny fact, Singapore, I was like, wait, city, state, country, it's all the same. It's one country, one city, one state, just one. It's just Singapore. It's a small island, so that was a pretty cool place to visit. Then obviously Australia and New Zealand blew us away, especially New Zealand. I will say, I don't know that we necessarily gave Australia as much time as it deserved. We were only in Australia for 10 days. It's a huge country, so obviously we didn't see that much. We did see some cool stuff. Sydney was a cool city. We went to National Park just outside Sydney. They have like 300 national parks or something in Australia. They just call any outdoor space a national park. So for those of you guys that have like a goal to go to all the US national parks, once you check those off, you can go over to Australia and start trying to check off all those. They have hundreds. But beautiful place. We went to Cairns and got to snorkel at the Great Barrier Reef. That was cool. We saw lots of kangaroos and koala bears. That was amazing. But really, New Zealand stole the show.
Yeah, and American Samoa, like I said, that was
I forgot about
our 60th national park, so we only have 3 after that. So that was really cool. But yeah, New Zealand was definitely the highlight of our trip and probably our #1 country that we've ever been to. It was just amazing. It's like, we keep trying to describe to people, like family and friends, Christmas, trying to describe it. And it's kind of like in our opinion, almost all the best parts of the U.S. just in a very small package. It's like the size of Wisconsin or something, but it's got glaciers and mountains and beautiful lakes, and it's got some like harbors and beaches. It's got really
volcanoes and hiking and just everything that you could want, like all the coolest places that we've been in the United States packaged into one island. So it's like the coast of driving the beautiful coast of California, and then going to the mountains of Colorado, and then going to the beaches of Hawaii, and then, you know, hiking the volcanoes like in Hawaii and Alaska, and pristine lakes like we saw in Montana, like amazing.
Yeah, and we're specifically talking mostly about the South Island, the size of Wisconsin, and has all of that stuff. The North Island is also amazing. There's hot springs, and that's where most of the beaches are, a little warmer weather. But the South Island, it's just, it's really hard to describe. It's like really all the best parts of Alaska with a lot less downsides in terms of like really cold and extreme changes in light and dark and mosquitoes. And so it's got a lot of the benefits with much less of the downside, which the biggest downside is how far away it is, because you know, everyone knows Australia and New Zealand are very far away, but we did not realize exactly how far away they are, because the flight from Auckland coming back home, we went from Auckland straight to Dallas, and that was a 14-hour flight, about 10 and a half or 11 hours of which were just over the Pacific. So in the middle of nowhere, which is just, it's hard to imagine how big the world is. It's just so big. Those flights are ridiculously long, but that's the biggest downside, is it's so far away.
Yeah, so we definitely want to go back and spend more time in New Zealand. We're always thinking of places that, like, is this somewhere we would actually like to live or actually like to spend several months out of the year? The biggest downside is how far away it is, but we loved New Zealand. If you get a chance to go, you absolutely should. It was amazing.
Yeah.
People are nice. Cost of living is similar to the U.S. Obviously, they speak English, so it's really a lot easier to get around. We rented a car, and we did not do a camper van. That's a very popular thing to do, but we weighed our options, and the camper vans were really expensive. And we really weren't sure about the weather and the camping situation, so we just decided to do a car, and we stayed at Airbnbs and hotels along the way, but we saw most of the North Island and the South Island, and it was a really fun road trip.
Yeah. P.S. We're going to have an article coming at some point in the future about working in New Zealand. We met up with someone there that is, basically they specialize in the licensing process of New Zealand and getting people placed in temporary jobs in New Zealand, which temporary, when you're going to another country, is not really like temporary in the U.S. It's more like probably 9 months or a year or even longer. But we're going to write about that, or have someone write about that, and probably do a video, answer any questions you guys have on that. But
yeah, because we did get a lot of questions about working in New Zealand, because there are a lot of people like us who have found out how wonderful New Zealand is, and they also want to go there and maybe stay for longer and work. Spoiler alert, you don't make as much money as a therapist working in New Zealand or Australia, but it would be like a working vacation. You would get the experience of living over there. So we'll do more on that later.
yeah, Ali said that Texas to Brisbane is now her commute. She goes back and forth from Texas to Brisbane. I was wondering, Ali, you work in Australia, right? What is the pay like compared to permanent pay in the U.S. or travel pay in the U.S.? I know that Australia pays a little higher than New Zealand, but I'm not really sure how it compares to the U.S.
Yeah, from what we were told, it seems like it's less, but it does seem like Australia, you make a little more than New Zealand. But anyway, amazing trip, just phenomenal. We went to so many cool places. It was definitely one of our top trips. We definitely spent more money than we have in past trips, but luckily we're in a better financial situation than when we first started traveling internationally, so we were a little more lenient,
Yeah.
but we do still try to be budget friendly.
Yeah, we spent more, but this was our favorite trip that we've ever taken, so it was worth it.
Yep. So let's get into...
By the way, Ali says the Australia pay is terrible, so
Yeah.
not
So
great.
our philosophy has always been, as travel therapists, to take advantage of the opportunity to work as travel PTs in the U.S., earn a lot more, and then just save up and take time off between contracts to go travel for fun. But we do understand and respect those of you that might want the experience of working abroad. Just know that you're not going to make a lot of money. You're going to make a lot more money working as a travel therapist in the U.S.
Yeah, and we've made a video about that. We have an article. It's called like Why We Don't Work Internationally or something like that. And yeah, it boils down to, the gist of it is that it's hard to get licensed in other countries. It's probably a 6-month to year process, and then the pay is significantly less. So for us, it's always made sense to work, save money in the U.S., and then travel for fun outside of the U.S.
Yeah. So we do have a lot to go over. Some of it we may just kind of skim over, quick bullet point, but it'll just give you guys some ideas of things to think about if you are thinking about traveling abroad for longer periods.
Yeah, and again, if you have any questions on our trip or our trip that we just took, or anything about international travel in general, feel free to ask those. We'll cover them at the end.
Yep.
Okay, so the first thing you want to think about is travel insurance. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One, as you guys can see, especially in the last week, there are a ton of flight cancellations, lost luggage, all of that. My bag got lost on this trip, luckily for only about 16 hours or something, so it wasn't a huge deal. But you want to have travel insurance. Our main reason for having travel insurance is not because of canceled flights or lost luggage. It's if some freak accident happens, like we're out on a boat or something and we break a leg or something, and we have to be airlifted back to the US, or something even more major than breaking a limb. We want to have travel insurance for that. And a lot of people don't realize how affordable travel insurance can be if you're not trying to insure for all the little tiny things and just the major things. I think usually our travel insurance for 4 or 5 month trips has been like $100 each or less, maybe $150 or less. So it's not that expensive for the peace of mind knowing that if I had a $50,000 emergency flight, that would be covered. So I think that's a no-brainer. If you're going to be taking a long trip, get travel insurance. On a shorter trip, maybe it doesn't make sense, but if you're going to be gone for 3 or 4 months, it definitely makes sense.
Yeah, we use a website called Squaremouth, and you just go in there and select the type of coverage, and it'll ask, how long is your trip, where you're traveling to, what amount of the trip you want covered. And so we usually just guesstimate a few $1,000s. We'll say $3,000. Even though our trip probably costs more than that, but we're it's not so much that $3,000 or $5,000, because a lot of times you'll be able to get some of your stuff refunded anyway, like your flights. You might be able to get a trip credit for a flight in the future, or your Airbnb, you might be able to get it refunded, so forth and so on. Or it might just be $100 here and there for something that you lose, but it's really just that catastrophic stuff that you want. So it'll say $50,000 in coverage for emergency evacuation, or $100,000 for loss of life, or some kind of major event or something like that.
Yeah, so we found a site, this was back in 2018 on our first trip, we found a site that compares different travel insurance packages, and you can enter what you want, and it gives you what companies offer the best price for what you're looking for. And we've used that for, I think, every trip so far. And it's called squaremouth.com. And that was really helpful. We just go in there, enter our information, what we're looking for, and have that compare it. And we usually just pick one of the top 2 or whatever it recommends. Those types of aggregators are really, really helpful. So squaremouth.com for travel insurance. And then the other thing you want to think about that we thought a lot more about after our first trip is that you want to make sure you have health insurance back home, even when you're traveling internationally. And it seems like a waste because I can't even use it. I'm not even going to be there. If something happens or something comes up on the trip, then you would just get your health insurance back home doesn't cover you on that. But what you have to think about again is those catastrophic incidences where, say, you had appendicitis and you have to be flown back to the US. Well, now you're back in the US, and if you don't have health insurance, then you're in a lot of trouble. So you want to have health insurance back home, even though you're going to be traveling internationally. So we think that those are the bare minimum of what you need is at least a basic travel insurance plan, and then health insurance back home in case something happens, even though you're not planning on using it.
And for the most part, if you did have to receive medical care while you were in the other country, sometimes they'll take your U.S. insurance or your travel insurance, but a lot of times you won't even have to worry about it, because a lot of countries, the healthcare is extremely affordable as a walk-in. You might even be covered under their national healthcare plan. Like when we were in New Zealand, they were if you're a tourist and you're in New Zealand and you show up to the hospital, you just get treated for free under their health plan. So you don't have to so much worry about that. It's more if you had to get airlifted back to the US. We knew somebody that broke their shoulder on a motorbike accident and had to be airlifted back to the US, and then they had to have surgery in the US to the tune of $10,000 or $20,000, right? Because they didn't have insurance back in the US.
Yeah, and we also met somebody, this was a secondhand story, so I'm assuming this is true, but anything could be made up. But this person was saying that they stayed at a hostel with this European backpacker that was in Guatemala when we were there, and that they got appendicitis, had to go to the hospital. They didn't have any kind of travel insurance, so they could not afford, backpackers are traveling extremely cheap. They couldn't afford to be airlifted from Guatemala back to the UK or wherever they were from. So they had surgery in Guatemala. And yeah, it might have been cheap, but they had they were talking about the surgery, the recovery was 3 weeks in the hospital there, whereas in the US that would be not a minor procedure, but it certainly wouldn't be 3 weeks in the hospital procedure. And they had this huge scar on their stomach. And so you want to avoid those types of situations. And travel insurance is something that it's kind of like a low-cost way to avoid something major.
Yeah. We've done lots of talks on insurance before, so go back and watch our videos on that. If you're not wanting to like pay a lot for insurance where you're going, you could always rely on Cobra as a backup plan, yada yada, so forth and so on. But watch our insurance videos for learning more about that.
About health insurance, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so flights. Like we were talking about earlier, flights are probably going to be your biggest expense, at least biggest single expense. The flight from wherever you're starting the trip in the U.S. to wherever you're beginning the trip, and then wherever you end the trip back to the U.S. Those flights can be $1,400 or $1,500 if you're, just booking regular economy tickets. It can be $4,000 or $5,000 if you're booking business class or first class. So those costs can be really high. The best way to try to mitigate some of that cost is using credit card points, and we have really taken advantage of this over the years. Just about every single flight, I think I could have said every international flight we'd ever taken from the U.S. was with points until this trip. Our last flight from Auckland back to the U.S., we couldn't find a good option, so we paid like $950 a person for the flight back home. But besides that, I think every other flight we've ever taken from the U.S. to another country or from another country to the U.S. has been with points. And the way we do it, part of the benefit of being a traveler and having a lot of flexibility and time is that you can kind of plan your trips around what makes sense cost-wise. And that's what we did. So our first trip, it made the most sense for us to fly, I think it was from the U.S. straight to Scotland or something like that. And we weren't necessarily planning on going there, but it was like, oh, okay, we're going to go to Scotland and we'll spend a few days there and then we'll start our trip. And then the rest of the flights around Europe and buses and stuff are very affordable. So if you can get a really reasonably priced flight or a flight with points from somewhere in the U.S. to somewhere on the continent that you're going to, then that saves you a lot of money. And same thing kind of with this flight or this trip to Greece. We didn't necessarily, we wanted to go to Greece, but it didn't have to be Greece. I was looking at almost anywhere in Europe to find a good point redemption, and then we knew we could take pretty inexpensive flights to get to Greece. And it just so happened that the flight to Athens was only like 25,000 miles, so that was really cheap. That's like basically $250 worth of points each. So we decided to book that flight. And we've done the same thing with other trips, like the flight to Lisbon was very affordable for us with points. And we basically base where we're going to start our trip and where we're going to end our trip based on where we can get the most reasonable flights and ideally with points.
So a lot of this takes a lot of advanced planning. So if you know that in the next couple of years you're going to want to do some international travel, we started working on credit card rewards well in advance of that, a couple of years in advance of that. So we just started getting American Airlines sign-up offers and Delta sign-up offers and all these different offers to where we were just banking a lot of points and had points. So then when it came time, it's like, oh, we want to go to Europe. So we just started looking on all the different websites, Delta, American Airlines, whoever else, United, and then see where you can get a flight into a major airport. Just check all the capitals, check London, check Paris, check, Greece, check wherever. Like, you just want to find a flight that works well. And then once you're there, it's usually so cheap, especially in Europe, to get to the next place. Mostly in Asia too, to get to the next place. Central South America, not quite as much.
Yeah, it's a lot more expensive, Central and South America, but anywhere in Europe and Asia, which are where most people want to go, the flights and the buses are extremely affordable. Like, for example, we took a ton of flights all around Europe from say London to Paris. The flight might be $20. It's very, very cheap. So if you can, say you really want to go to Paris, if you can fly to London for $400 less than it would be to fly to Paris and then take a $20 flight from there, it's a no-brainer to do that. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Even if you want to go to somewhere, don't always have to fly directly to that place to start. You can always fly somewhere else and then take a cheap flight to the place you want to go to.
Allie says a flight from New Zealand or Australia around Christmas time can be really expensive. So she says you did very well finding one for $900. We spent, I kid you not,
2 days.
More than 12 hours, probably like 15 hours, both of us, 2 laptops, multiple headaches, searching every possible way to try to get back from New Zealand or even American Samoa or Australia to the US, using points, using money. And after like a couple days of searching, I just was like, you know what, can we just please get this economy class ticket for $900? That seems pretty reasonable at this point.
Yeah, and it worked out okay. Okay, so flights, that's your biggest expense, especially if you're going to be traveling around the same continent and you can fly cheap or take buses pretty cheaply. Your flights to and from, if you can do that with points, definitely do it. If you can't do it with points, then try to look at different cities that you could fly into to start, and then start from there, and then take a flight or a bus to your real starting point. So keep that in mind. After flights, the second most expensive thing is pretty much always going to be your lodging. And that's also where credit card points can come in handy, especially if you're in somewhere like Europe where some of the accommodations can be really expensive. So kind of what we try to do is we do a mixture of things to try to keep our trips more reasonable. One thing we try to do is we try to mix expensive places and cheap places on each trip. So say in our 2018 trip, we knew we were going to go to Asia. Asia is extremely affordable. I mean, we could travel for a month all around Asia and probably spend less than $1,000 per person. So we knew that was going to be really, really pretty cheap. And so since we knew that was going to be cheap, we could throw in like a month in Europe that was going to be more expensive. And especially if we could take advantage of some credit card rewards, free hotel nights, and credit card points to book some hotels in those more expensive places in Europe. Like we stayed in like Brussels and Amsterdam. We used hotel nights there where it was pretty expensive to stay. So if you can kind of balance out expensive places and cheap places on the same trip to make the average cost a little more affordable, and then you combine that with credit card points for some hotels in those really expensive places, then you can make your accommodations way less than you would ever think they could be.
Yep. And for those of you guys that are maybe a little bit lost on when we say points, we've done some videos in the past where we talked about travel hacking in general and how to utilize credit card rewards. The biggest bang for your buck is going to be if you get sign-up offers. So some of these credit cards will offer a sign-up offer where if you get it at the right time, say you apply for the credit card and they'll have a spending requirement. It's usually about $3,000 in 3 months. They'll give you a set number of points, say if it's for an airline, or it could just be credit card points like Chase or American Express points for them that you can then later transfer to a travel partner, which could be an airline or a hotel chain. Or they have some hotel chain cards, like we've used like the Hilton Honors credit card quite often to get Hilton points. We've used Marriott to get Marriott points.
Hyatt is where we spend a lot of nights.
And so then once you get into those strategies, we have a page on our website actually, traveltherapymentor.com/credit. And Jared will pick out some of the best offers that are currently out there. He hasn't updated it just recently, but we'll try
like a month ago.
We'll try to do that again here in the coming weeks. Put the new best offers on there, but you can also Google it. There are other websites out there that will list good current offers if you're thinking about getting a new travel rewards credit card. But try to take advantage of those sign-up offers and get a big amount of points. You're going to get a lot more that way than if you're just like, say you just have a Hilton Honors credit card and you do all your regular spending on it, getting 1 point per dollar that you spend or whatever. You're not going to get as many points as quickly doing it that way as you will doing the sign-up offers.
Yeah, and you might think, oh, well, you really can't save that much with credit card points. I've added it up just recently, and just in the free flights we've gotten for probably the 5 or 6 international trips, the long ones that we've done, we've probably saved about $10,000 in flights, at least $10,000, and that's not including like domestic flights to CSM and stuff like that we get for free. And then in hotel nights, we've had over 100 free hotel nights just in the last 4 or 5 years from hotel points and free nights. So that saved us another over $10,000. So it's huge savings you can get. It's not just like, oh, save a couple $100 on this trip. It's a lot of money.
There's other even like smaller strategies once you kind of get the hang of that and can use some points to go places. Obviously you want to look at where you can get the most bang for your buck. So like we were able to find, especially in Eastern Europe, a lot of Hilton and Hyatt nights that we could get really cheaply for like a very low number of points. I forget what the category of points there might be, but say in the US it might have cost you 50,000 points to get a regular old Holiday Inn, and there it might only be like 10,000. Some of these places can be really cheap redemptions and you get way more bang for your buck to use it in some places like that. Also some of them, I think, is it Hilton that does the 5th night free?
Hilton and Marriott.
Hilton and Marriott have a thing where if you stay 5 consecutive nights, you get the 5th night free with your certain reward status. So you really are only having to pay with your points for 4 nights, and then you get a 5th night free. So if you can strategize where you're staying at least 5 nights at that hotel, you're going to save that way.
Yeah.
We did that a bunch in Europe. We had like, what, 25 or 30 free nights?
Yeah, I think we had like 30 free nights in one trip. So
that's a whole month of free hotel nights.
Yeah. And like I mentioned earlier, Hyatt, we use that quite a bit because Hyatt has 5,000 point hotels all around the world, and we've stayed at a bunch of them. And 5,000 Hyatt points you can get pretty easily. I mean, one sign-up bonus can sometimes get you 60,000 points, which is 12 free nights. So that can be very valuable.
Yeah. So besides that, if we don't have hotel points, we typically don't stay at hotels because hotels are most of the time going to be a lot more expensive. Now, of course, there are some countries where hotels and motels can be fairly cheap. For example, actually in New Zealand, we found that the motels were quite often like fairly affordable, and sometimes there weren't good Airbnb options, but for the most part, most countries we choose Airbnb because a lot of times you can get Airbnb nights for $20, $30, $40, $50 a night compared to a hotel, 100 plus a night, right?
Yeah, and depending on where you are, in Vietnam, we had some Airbnbs there that were between $6 and $10 a night. So they can be extremely, extremely cheap.
Yeah.
And if you're combining that, those cheap places, you're staying at these really reasonably cost Airbnbs, combined with using hotel points for the expensive places, yeah, you can really travel cheaply.
Yeah, and it just depends too on how comfortable you are, what kind of traveler you are. There are some people who are comfortable in staying in hostels, and you can definitely save money there. But if you are a little more older, or you like a little more of your own personal space, and I just mean older, like in your 30s, like us, like we don't really like to stay at hostels. If you're a couple, sometimes it doesn't really make sense to stay at hostels because you usually have to pay by the bed. And so if you have to pay for 2 beds, quite often you're going to break even by just splitting an Airbnb. So we find that quite often Airbnbs are the same as paying for 2 beds in a hostel for us, and a lot more private and comfortable.
Yeah, if we could either pay for 2 beds in a hostel, have that the same price as a private room in an Airbnb, we will do the private room all day.
Yeah, but sometimes don't be totally deterred from hostels, because there are some hostels that will have private rooms, and it's basically just like a budget hotel. Like you'll have your very own room. It's just like not like a 5-star hotel because it's within a hostel, but it can be private. And then also we used to, when we first started traveling, we would rent a room in someone's house for an Airbnb, and we were more comfortable with that. These days we splurge a little bit more, and we like to get a whole apartment to ourselves, so we have more room to like get our online work done and stuff like that. But if you're really trying to save money, we had a good experience all over the world staying in rooms in people's houses. I know some people at first like feel kind of weird about that, but we always had a good experience. People are usually really kind, and
yeah, we've done it all over the world, all over Europe, all over Asia. Even some in Mexico, South America. We've stayed in rooms and houses everywhere. So, I mean, of course, Airbnb, you have reviews. You're not going to stay somewhere that there's no reviews or anything. But if it's a place that has good reviews, then you can often save a lot of money, and it's usually a very good experience.
Yep. So those are some of our main tips as far as strategizing and planning your trip and saving the most money. You're going to save the most money by getting good deals on your flights and your accommodations. So we just want to briefly go over some smaller things that I don't think we've ever really touched on before, where we'll get questions that we're just like, oh yeah, well, we kind of forgot that you even need to wonder about those things because we just sort of figured it out along the way. But here's just some like basic strategies for traveling abroad.
Yeah, so something to think about is your phone plan. A lot of people choose to go to each country and buy a SIM card for their phone there. We think that is probably not the best option if you're going to do a long trip where you're moving countries a lot, because there can be a lot of issues with the SIM cards. So we, instead of doing that, we have an international phone plan. So Sprint, T-Mobile, Google Fi all have pretty good international phone plans. So Whitney right now is on Sprint. I'm on Google Fi. We like to be a little bit diversified in the carriers we use, so that if one of us doesn't have service, maybe the other one does. They all offer free international data and free international texting. So that really helps. We never have to worry about SIM cards. We've never dealt with SIM cards. The only time I think SIM cards make sense is if you're going to if you plan a trip and you're going to go to just Australia for 3 months, then great, yeah, get a SIM card because you don't have to change it out. You just get it one time, pay for the service, and you're done with it. But if you're going to go to a country for just like 3 or 4 days, adding the, I guess the extra work of finding a SIM card, making sure it works, all that into just that 3 or 4 day period is probably not ideal.
Yeah, because sometimes like right when you get to the airport, they might not be open yet, or like you might not be able to get the SIM card right away. It's like a whole thing. But the plane lands, we turn on our phone, it says, "Welcome to Australia. In Australia, Sprint customers get data for free, and calling's $1 a minute," or whatever, and like it just works.
Yeah, Ali said Google Fi has worked well for her for international travel. This was the first trip we've ever been on where I had Google Fi, and it was awesome. It was the data was like US data, whereas on Whitney's Sprint plan and my previous T-Mobile plan, it was like 3G. It wasn't really great. I mean, it still worked, but Google Fi had like LTE, 4G data. It was really good. Another thing to think about is how you're going to get money out. This is something we spend a lot of time thinking about. A lot of places accept cash or accept cards, obviously. So if you take a credit card that has no foreign transaction fees, that should be how you make most of your purchases. If you're going to a restaurant or a grocery store, use a card with no foreign transaction fees. And I mean, there's probably 100 credit cards out there that don't have foreign transaction fees. So it's easy to find one. Some of them don't even have annual fees, so you don't have to worry about that. Besides that, though, you're going to need to get cash at some point. And if you go to like a currency conversion place at the airport or on the street, they almost always take advantage of you. They know that you're a tourist. They know, I mean, you wouldn't be exchanging money if you weren't. So they're going to give you pretty bad exchange rates.
Not only that, imagine how are you going to figure out how much cash you need to bring with you for a 2, 3, 4 month trip. Like when we first were thinking about this, we were like, we're not going to bring $5,000 in US dollars like cash with us. That's absurd. You know, you risk losing it. You risk getting robbed. Like you're not going to carry around that much cash. So it never really made sense to me. I'm like, I can't just bring all this cash and then exchange it at every country we go to.
I would, on that same note though, I would bring at least probably $500 or $600 in cash just to have, not even planning to convert it, but just to have in case something happened.
In case of emergency.
Yeah, in case of emergency. And we ran into a situation where they wanted American dollars this time. Sometimes you get discounts in US dollars. A lot of people that haven't traveled internationally don't realize how valuable US dollars are in other countries. But some of them are trying to specifically collect US dollars and save them because their currency devalues against the dollar. And there's no way for them to get US dollars unless people bring them there. So there's situations where you might want to have dollars. So take $500 or $600, maybe even $1,000 if you're going to be gone for a long time. But the best way to convert money that we found is to get an ATM card that refunds your fees for ATMs internationally. And there's only a couple of those. One is the Charles Schwab debit card. And the other one was like a Fidelity debit card. So Whitney got the Charles Schwab card, I got a Fidelity card. We've only ever used hers, and it's worked perfectly every time. But when you go to an ATM with that card, it gives you the going rate for the conversion, whatever it is at the time. And then you also get refunded any fees the ATM charges. So you get basically the best rate you can get doing that.
So what we recently learned, and what we didn't realize we were doing wrong for a little while actually, was each ATM, because you can just go to any ATM, it doesn't matter what bank, it can be the Bank of Thailand, the Bank of Germany, whatever bank it is at that local airport or place, and you can put your card in there, your Charles Schwab debit card, and so they're going to offer you a conversion rate. So say if the dollar is supposed to be it's like $1 US to 0.63 New Zealand dollars, right? That's what it says on Google, like that's what the official transaction rate is or whatever, conversion rate. But that bank might be giving you a worse deal. They might say like, we'll only give you 50 cents on every dollar. And so sometimes what you can do, what we didn't realize but we realized later, is you can just decline the conversion that bank is offering you, and it'll default back to whatever Charles Schwab is going to offer you, which is usually going to be better.
Yeah, that's we've done several trips now, and it took a year and a half out of the country to figure that out. But that's the smart way to do it. It's also a little bit better usually if you go to like an actual bank ATM instead of just like one of these, like you'll see small ATMs all over that are just kind of like privately owned, but like a specific bank ATM a lot of times will give you better conversions anyway. But yeah, if you decline that conversion, it's usually the best.
Yep, so just put your debit card in, decline the conversion rate, let it default back to whatever Charles Schwab will give you. It's going to say there's a $4.99 fee for using this ATM. You just say, okay, yeah, fine, that's fine. And then at the end of each month, Charles Schwab will debit you back a credit for all the fees. So you won't have to pay that $4.99 transaction fee.
Yeah, so between that debit card and a credit card with no foreign transaction fees, you really end up paying almost nothing in fees, and you get almost the ideal conversion. So that's the best way to handle it.
The other thing is when you go to pay for something, if when you pay with your credit card at a credit card machine at a restaurant or whatever, sometimes they'll ask you, do you want to have them charge it in local currency or in US dollars? You always want to choose in local currency because it's kind of the same thing with that conversion rate. If you say in US dollars, now the restaurant is deciding the conversion rate. So the restaurant might not be giving you a good conversion rate. So you just want to actually charge it in their local currency.
Yep. I saw Owen's in here. What's going on? I actually saw your trip to Switzerland recently, and it makes me really want to go to Switzerland. Switzerland's one of the only countries in Western Europe we haven't been to. So our next trip, probably Switzerland. Okay. Packing. This is a big thing. If you're going to go on a long international trip, we think it's a no-brainer at this point to only use carry-on whenever possible, because especially with our most recent trip, my bag got lost. On the way home, it's not a huge deal if your bag gets lost because you have stuff at home. But if you're in the middle of a 5-month trip and your bag gets lost, that is a nightmare, because you don't know how long it's going to be until they find it. You don't know if they're going to find it. If they do find it, you don't know where you're going to be when they find it. So say you lose it in Chiang Mai and you're like, well, for 4 days I'll be here, but then after that I'll be here, and after that I'll be here. That's a nightmare. And you don't,
because they might send it to wherever your flight was supposed to be. They're like, oh, it's in Bangkok, that's your final destination. And we're like, well, we're already in Singapore, so.
You do not want to be in that situation. So that's like a worst case scenario. And if you can at all avoid that, and on top of that, you also avoid a lot of fees by not checking bags. I mean, often we'll save $30 or $40 by not checking a bag and only having carry-ons.
It's also a lot less hassle. So when we first started traveling internationally, Jared had read about a lot of other people traveling with carry-ons. And to me, that sounded absurd. I was like, how am I going to pack 5 months worth of stuff in a carry-on, right? But once we started talking about it, all the places that we were going to go, it's like you're on all these flights, you're on all these buses, you're on public transport, you're on the subway, you're on the metro, you're on a tuk-tuk in Cambodia. You're in a taxi, you're walking down the street to find your Airbnb, you're, walking down the street to get to the subway. It's so much more convenient if you just have a small bag and not a rolly suitcase. So the backpack suitcase has been the way to go for us. If you need to do a rolly suitcase, we get it, as long as it's a little one. But quite often on some of these budget airlines or airlines in other countries, a rolly suitcase won't count as a carry-on. So for us, the backpack suitcase has been the way to go.
Yeah, and make sure it's not too big, because you want to pay attention to where you're going to be going and what the local airlines count as a carry-on versus what you have to check if it's too heavy. We've definitely had situations where our bags were heavier than they should have been, and I think only twice out of probably 120 flights now have they ever actually weighed it and we had to pay extra.
Either that or they made us check it.
Or they made us check it.
But for the most part, we've gotten away with our carry-ons. If you guys are interested, I did write a blog post a while back about how to pack for several months in a carry-on. It is doable. Even for us girls that have lots of outfits and shoes, it is doable. And I also have a link on there to the backpack style suitcase that we use, which has been really awesome. We've been using it for 5 years now.
Yeah, can't recommend that enough. Packing carry-on only really saves you a lot of time. Also, another thing about using only a carry-on is when you get to the airport at the next place, you don't have to wait for your bag another 20 minutes. You can go straight out and beat everybody on your flight to get an Uber, which helps as well. So a lot of advantages to only using a carry-on.
Also something we did this trip that we've never done before that was kind of new. We got air tags for our luggage. We got 4 of them. We stuck 1 in each suitcase and 1 in each personal item. And that's really given us a lot of peace of mind to know where our bags are at all times. So the couple times we did have to check them, it worked out really well with Jared's suitcase because it did get lost on the way back. So we were able to see whoops, my bag, it says it's here, your bag, it's still in Texas. Just in case, if the airline, what's going on right now with the Southwest stuff, they're losing people's bags and their computer system is down and people don't know where their bags are. So at least you can track it yourself and kind of have some peace of mind.
Yeah. Okay, so another thing that we have definitely figured out on our trips that we did not at all know when we started is that there's a lot of fatigue. We can't talk about this enough, how tired you get, especially if you do an international trip and you're moving every 2 or 3 days, or even 1 day in some situations. We would really recommend that if you're going to do a long trip, 2 months or more, I would say anything more than probably 6 weeks is a pretty extended international trip. You should probably stay in each place that you want to go for, I would say, a minimum of 4 days, but probably 5 days. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One, it gives you a little bit of downtime. You don't have to have everything packed in just a couple days. Another thing is you often, with the Airbnbs, you'll get a discount if you stay for 5 days or more. And then, like we talked about earlier, if you're using hotel points or you're booking even just cash at a hotel, a lot of them have 5th night free. So it makes a lot of sense to stay 5 nights in most places. And we found that to kind of be the sweet spot where we're not there so long that we're like, all right, well, there's nothing else to do. And we're not there so short that we're like, oh, we just got here and now we're packing again to leave.
Yeah, because 4 and 5 nights boils down to only 3 and 4 days where you actually have time to do stuff, because one of your first day is a travel day and your last day is a travel day, right? So it's important to have a little bit of downtime, to not feel so tired, to not feel like you have to be so go, go, go. You're going to want to work in like laundry once a week or once every 10 days. You're going to want to work in a day to just like relax and catch up on sleep and whatever else you need to catch up on. For us, that's work. You know, the other thing is too, what happens if you get sick? It's so miserable if you get sick while you're traveling, and it happens sometimes with different food and all this kind of stuff. And so we found out this time, I got sick one day. I woke up sick the morning we had to leave and go fly somewhere, and it was awful to be sick on a travel day. Like, it's so much better if it happens and you just have a day to like relax and like, but the more often you're moving, the more chances are you could be sick on a travel day, right?
Yep. Another thing we've learned from taking a bunch of different length trips, 5 months, 4 months, 3 months, 2 months, 2 months, is that 4 and 5 month trips are too long for us. And I'm sure this is different for everyone, but we think that probably 2 or 3 months is probably the longest you want to travel internationally because you get tired. It doesn't even matter if you're spending 5 days in each place and everything's perfect. What you don't think about on these types of trips is that you go to a new place. A lot of times the bed situation is not ideal. A lot of times the pillow situation is not ideal. Sometimes it's hotter than you're used to sleeping, so you don't sleep well. Sometimes there's a lot of light coming in that you can't stop. Yeah, there's noise outside. There's all these things that impact your sleep and make you not nearly as recovered as you would be back home. So even though you think like, oh, I could travel, it won't be a big deal. I can go for 5 or 6 months. We'll probably never plan another trip more than 3 months because we just get way too tired by the end. And actually, at the end of our 5 month trip, we were ready to go home. We probably like the last 3 or 4 weeks, we were like, okay, where are we going next? Okay, when are we going home? Because it was just too much.
You also get a little bit of like decision fatigue because you're having to like decide literally where you're going to eat every day.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not in a good situation to be able to cook, you're having to just make decisions every single day about what restaurant you want to eat at, and it just gets tiring, and you're doing new things all the time. So I know that sounds so silly, like, oh, the plight of decision fatigue, but it just, after a while, it gets tiring, and then it's like, well, am I even enjoying traveling?
Yeah.
Right?
It sounds silly if you've only done like a week or two trip, because for the first month or even the first 6 weeks of a trip, it's so much excitement that you can override all that. It's like, oh, wow, we're going to eat all the time. Oh, this is so great. Oh, wow, we're going all these new places and sleeping in all these new places. All that's fine for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 weeks, or 1 week. It's, everything's great in that time period because everything's new. But once you get to like 2 months, 2.5, 3 months, it really starts to wear on you.
Yep. So we think that the sweet spot is about 2 to 3 months. The other thing about working in some downtime, also trying to fit in working out if you're somebody who likes to exercise. Again, if you're only on a 1 or 2 week trip, it's like, forget all the routines. I don't need to work out on vacation. But if you're like kind of living this life of traveling for 2 and 3 months, you're going to want to make time for yourself and your health and working out. So allow some downtime for those types of things.
And that's something we still struggle with. Even after all the trips we've done, this most recent one, I was like, all right, we're going to eat a little better. We're going to go find gyms more often. And it's hard to do because when do you fit in the gym? And it's very hard to eat healthy when you're eating out 2 or 3 times a day. Even if you really make an effort to do it, it's very difficult. So something that kind of you have to plan ahead and try to find gyms, and sometimes the gyms are expensive for day passes. Sometimes they don't allow it at all, and how are you going to get there? You're going to take an Uber to the gym, and that takes a lot of time. And so things like that, if you can plan it out ahead of time, that really helps.
Yep. Also, we really enjoy having some meaningful work to do so that it's not all just vacation for 2 to 3 months. So our very first trip, we had our blog at that time, but we actually had the creative space and the time to create our business while we were on our Asia trip in 2018. We created Travel Therapy Mentor while we were there. We went from being just kind of bloggers to having this online business because we had the space and the time, and we wanted things to work on and do. We didn't want to just be vacationing for 5 months. So for you, that might look like something else. Maybe you have a blog, or you have something that you're passionate about working on. Maybe it's just something like journaling.
Yeah, maybe you're writing a book and you're just gradually adding pages to that.
Or you're learning. Maybe you're taking the time to learn a new language or read up on something while you're gone. But find some time to build in something meaningful so it's not just all vacation for several months. Okay, a couple more things. So talking a little bit about meals. Some ways that we try to save money and also save our stomachs is not eating out too much. We quite often will do intermittent fasting where we don't eat in the morning and then we just eat out like once or twice a day. We usually try not to eat out more than twice a day. We usually try to get at least one of our meals to be just like a meal on the go, like grab something from the grocery store or have something at our hotel. If you have the option to have a kitchen and cook, that's great. Or maybe it's just something simple, like you get bread and peanut butter to have peanut butter sandwiches once a day, so that you're not spending money for 3 meals a day, and also because it really is just sickening to eat out 3 times a day.
Well, it's sickening and it's a little bit risky because you might not think a lot about food poisoning in your daily life, but if you're traveling for a long time, you really have to think about it. And I don't think we've had a trip yet where we didn't have some sort of stomach illness from food we ate. And the reason for that, there's a variety of reasons. One, a lot of times standards in other countries are not as good in terms of cleanliness and hygiene as they are in the US. And the other thing is, in the US, at least for us, we might eat out twice a week. Most of our food we're cooking at home. We know exactly what goes in it. We might get food poisoning in the US like once every 5 or 6 years, but you're only eating out twice a week compared to when you're on the road, you might be eating out 21 times a week. Yeah, so like your odds are just a lot higher of having something happen at a restaurant and you getting sick from it. So if at all, you can limit how many times you're eating out. It's better for your health and it's less risky.
Yeah, as we all know, they make stuff taste really good at restaurants by adding a bunch of extra oils and stuff, so it's not always the healthiest. As far as saving money, when possible, with those free hotel nights, sometimes they'll offer free breakfast. That can really help. We usually try to take advantage of that and eat like a really big breakfast, and then try to offset like 1 or 2 of our meals for the rest of the day with that. Also, in terms of like eating out a lot, especially when you're in foreign cultures that have a really different cuisine than what you're used to, like for example Asia, we try to work in Western meals a couple times a week just to get that familiarity, because sometimes our stomachs would get really upset with our palate would just be like really overeating Asian food every single day, so we try to like squeeze in a club sandwich and a burger here and there.
Yeah, and again, a lot of that is just going to these restaurants that use a lot of oil and use a lot of things that we don't use at home. We really try to avoid using oil when we cook at home, but when you're eating at restaurants, you're eating oil at every single meal.
Fried stuff. Use caution when eating at food stalls. We're not saying don't eat street food. We eat street food all the time, but you just have to be smart about eating street food. We ate street food all the time in Asia. Definitely got sick sometimes, but something we learned is if you're going to eat street food, try to get food that is cooked piping hot right in front of you. And food that hasn't been sitting out for too long.
Yeah. So don't buy stuff that's already been cooked, and don't buy stuff that's raw. So street food is not where you want to buy sushi, or you want to buy something that they cooked and they just have sitting in a glass container or something. You don't know if it's been there it could be there for 5 hours. It could have been there since the day before and they brought it back. You have no idea. Yeah. So if it's something that's raw and they cook in front of you, you have a lot better odds there. Yeah.
So like if they cook it in a wok or something right in front of you and you can see it being made on the grill or the wok, perfect. Especially also if it's a busy time of day and you see other people coming and going and there's a line there and the food is turning over fast, that's a better sign than if nobody's going to that stall and that person could have been there since this morning and had all that same food not getting turned over. So just be smart when you are going to eat street food. Yep. Something else, try to avoid like smoothies or things that are made with like water. If you don't see that they have like a sink readily available or like clean ice, you don't necessarily know if that water is good or not. And obviously,
chances are it's not.
Yeah. We definitely got sick from some smoothies. We would tend to try to only get smoothies if it was an indoor store location where hopefully they had like a better water source and all that. And then the other thing to think about with drinking water, obviously in countries that are developing countries, like if you're in Asia and Africa and South America, or Central America definitely, for the most part you do not drink the tap water. However, if you're in like pretty developed Western countries, like most of Europe, you can drink the tap water. So we always bring our refillable bottles and try to cut down on plastic waste when we can. So like all over Europe and Australia, New Zealand, we just filled our bottle with the tap water. For the most part, you just Google, is it safe to drink the water in the city? And most of the major cities are.
Yeah, and if not, if it's somewhere that you can't drink the tap water, a lot of times they don't recommend you drink it at all. Then try to buy like big jugs of water. Like we normally would buy as big as they had, but that's usually like 5-liter jugs or gallon jugs that we can refill our bottles with instead of just buying a bunch of small bottles. One, it's a lot less plastic, and two, it saves you money anyway, so it's a smart thing to do.
Yep. Just a couple more things we want to highlight here before we wrap up. So another strategy would be getting around new places. A lot of people have concerns with traveling to a new place. We couldn't travel the way that we do without all the modern technology. It's so easy now though. If you have a smartphone, download Google Maps. It's incredibly helpful. It makes it so much easier to get around. You can find everything you need on Google Maps.
Yes.
Even down to teaching you how to use the transport in that city. So if you go to Maps and you say, I want to get from point A to point B, and then instead of selecting the driving option or the walking option, select the one that looks like a train, and it will show you the public transportation option. So it'll show you the bus route, what time to get the bus, what time to get the metro, which metro stop to take. It'll transfer you from this metro to that metro to this bus, walk 5 minutes in between. It tells you all that.
It's really amazing. It's hard to believe. If you've never used the public transportation feature on Google Maps, it's ridiculous, because I don't know how people, I guess you traveled before, it just took a lot of trial and error and figuring things out, and you just like show up 20 minutes early and you just hope for the best. But with Google Maps, I mean, it shows you exactly the quickest way, what time the train's coming, what time the bus comes usually.
It sometimes
really
even
helpful.
tells you how much it is, but not always. So a lot of times when we get to a new city or a new country, we'll just Google, how does the public transport work here? Can you pay cash? Sometimes you can pay cash in the local currency to the bus driver or on the metro or whatever, but a lot of times you have to get one of their cards, their metro cards, and reload it. So Google it. Google is your friend. Hopefully, again, if you've already got your international phone plan, you have it already, so you can just get on your data right away at the airport, right when you get there, and figure it out. We figure this stuff out on the fly all the time. When we moved countries so often in Europe and in Asia, we never researched that stuff before we got there. We just rolled up at the airport, and sometimes the next day we'd be like, which country are we going to, and what language do they speak there?
Yeah.
And we would, what currency?
Yeah.
And we're just like Googling this stuff while we're at the airport. So Google is your friend. Having access to data on your phone is your friend. Google Translate, as far as the language barriers go, can be really helpful. But fortunately for us, if you're a native English speaker, you're pretty golden when you're traveling. That's not too bad for getting around, because most people speak English. Most places have signs in English in other countries.
Yeah, and another thing about Google Maps, we use that probably 10 times a day on every day that we're traveling, because we're also looking at restaurants and reviews on restaurants and restaurant menus and everything all on Google Maps. So we use that a ton.
The other thing that's a good idea to do on Google Maps, you can download the offline maps. So that way, just in case your data is not that good or you don't have good service, you'll still be able to see where you need to go. But you have to download it for like a very small map area. It might just be one city or whatever. So each new city you're in, you could download the offline map if you needed that. And then even if you didn't have service, you could see where you need to go to get around. It's very helpful. Also, a lot of countries will have ride-sharing apps. So they might have Uber or they might have something else similar to Uber. Again, Google is your friend. Just look it up. It's really easy to get around these days.
Almost every country, or at least every continent now, has their own version of Uber, and they're all named different stuff. A lot of times they're extremely affordable. This was crazy, but in Egypt, I can't remember what it was called, but there was a ride sharing.
I think it was Uber.
Was it Uber?
I think it was Uber.
Okay, well, a ride sharing app there, and we booked a car to take us, I think it was an hour that we had to drive, and it cost $6. Whatever the conversion was from Egyptian pounds to US dollars. It's just insanely cheap for stuff like that. So we could have either waited a bunch of time, taken a bus that was like $3 each, or we could take an Uber for $6. So never forget that Uber is an option, or whatever their version of Uber is, and you can always find that on Google.
Yeah. Now, not everywhere is going to have a ride-sharing app. Sometimes you have to use traditional taxis or tuk-tuks or whatever the mode of transportation would be. We try to avoid that when possible, because a lot of times they'll rip you off and you don't know what a normal rate is supposed to be. But try to, crowdsource, maybe ask the hotel or the Airbnb host, what should it cost? Especially like your first ride to get from the airport to your accommodation is usually the first time you're trying to figure out your transport. So usually if we have an Airbnb, we'll say, hey, what's the best way to get from the airport to your place? And they'll say, get a taxi outside, just walk out and get a taxi. And we'll say, okay, great, what should we expect? And then they'll say $5, $10, $20. Then we just at least know a ballpark of what's normal. So that way if the taxi driver tries to rip us off, we'll be like, no, it's only supposed to be this much.
Yeah, that helps.
So just some ideas there for getting around. But luckily, with technology these days, it's so easy to get around. You shouldn't have that much trouble, but you'll figure it out as you go.
Yep.
Okay, last little thing we want to mention is when you're planning traveling and you're doing activities, again, we try to use strategies to offset our costs when we're doing activities. There are going to be some things that are bucket list items that are must-do items that you're going to spend all the money on because, you know, if you're in Egypt, you're not going to not go to the pyramids, right? Like you're going to pay whatever it costs to do that.
Yeah, we like to save money on things that are like flights and the hotels and avoiding like the really overly touristy things. But if there's any bucket list items or really cool things in an area, don't skip those things. Like that's the whole reason you travel in the first place. So that's not the area to save money. Save money on the big things, the flights and the hotels, and then you can do a lot of the extra stuff and not feel bad about it or not be breaking your budget because that's the whole reason for traveling.
Right. So just go into it knowing like if you're on this big trip and there's a few bucket list items, you know for sure like you're going to spend the money on that. But then the other days of your trip, if there's just other things that like, well, you know, these days we could do this or this, try to offset some of those bigger, more expensive things with some free stuff. There's so many cool free things that you can find to do in new cities. So we always search like free things to do in this area, and it'll be just cool stuff like walking around and like doing this architecture tour, or there'll be free museums or free botanical gardens that you can go to, or
hikes. We do a lot of hikes. If it's a city that there's any way to get on a bus to any outlying areas and you can hike up and see the whole city, those are usually free and they're usually awesome.
Yeah, free walking tours. Free walking tours are not exactly free, but they're tip based. So you're not having to pay $65 to go on a tour. You just pay what you feel like paying, and usually that's 10 or 20 bucks. You give them a tip. Those are pretty fun to do, and you get a good overview of a city. They have a lot of those, like in Europe especially.
Yep.
But there's a lot of affordable things you can do. Now, if you just Google top things to do in a city, a lot of times those will be sponsored posts, and they'll say like, pay $150 to go to the top of the Space Needle or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, how many Space Needles do you need to go to the top of? Maybe a couple, but like, do you need to do that in every city? Maybe not.
Although, I will say, on this trip, Whitney made me pay $40 to go to the top of the Burj Khalifa.
Which is the tallest building in the world. If you're going to pay to go to the one top of one building, you should go to the top of the tallest building in the world. Am I right?
I think we could have skipped it. You can see it's tall. Out there, it's wild. It's so
but
high.
then after that, when there were other cities where there was the option to go to he's like, no, we've been to the tallest one. We don't need to go to these other ones.
A lot of that stuff you can skip. I mean,
Yeah.
unless it's just like for the novelty of doing it or whatever. But there's so many things that we've done that, you know, are really touristy things that it's like, that really was not worth it at all. There's cooler things we could have done, and they're always overpriced anyway. So think about if it's something that you really want to do, or if it's just something that you think that you have to do because people are like, oh, I went there and I went to the tallest building, you know, whatever.
Yep. So anyway, there's a lot of ways that you can find strategies to save money traveling internationally. You have to prioritize what's really important to you, what you want to splurge on, where you can save money in other areas. But again, to wrap up and summarize, if you can save money by using credit card rewards for your hotels and your flights, those are going to be two of the biggest things.
Yeah. And if you guys aren't familiar, on every trip that we've ever done, any of these international trips, I've kept track of all of my expenses on the trips. So if you go to the fifthwheelpt.com website, there's an international travel section, and every trip we've ever taken, I've got all of my expenses for accommodations, for food, for activities, whatever we did. And you can see how cheap it can be. It's actually amazing how affordably you can travel on these long trips if you use points and you know, you kind of balance your expensive places with cheaper places. But to give an example, for our 5 months in Asia, I spent less than $6,000. And you know, no one would ever think, or it was Europe and Asia, and then we also went to Morocco. But no one would ever think that you can travel for 5 months around the world and spend less than $6,000. And again, back then we were being pretty frugal, making decisions that we probably wouldn't make today, but still it's possible. So if you're a third-year student, you're thinking about traveling, you're gonna do like 2 or 3 contracts, you can easily save enough money to take a 4 or 5 month trip. It doesn't have to be really expensive.
Yeah. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys. Let us know if you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button, leave us a comment and let us know if you learned something. If you guys have any questions, we'll go through all the questions for those of you that are watching live and answering questions. If you do watch later on the replay, please feel free to leave a comment. We will go back and answer it. If you're listening on the podcast or something like that, you can send us an email or a message on Facebook or Instagram if you have any questions. But yeah, this is totally doable. I think it doesn't hurt to say again, we've said this many times, what we have done is recreatable.
For sure.
We're not special, we haven't, been blessed with all this extra money. You guys, if you have the opportunity to be a travel therapist, you can do this too, a travel nurse, whatever. You just need that flexibility with your work to where you can take the time off, and then you just need to be wise with your money and your spending so that you can save and strategize.
Yeah, and of all the ways you could spend money, international travel has got to be one of the top ways. The things that we've learned in these trips about different cultures, about ourselves, about even our relationship, like traveling together with another person for a long period of time, you learn a lot about your interactions with each other. So it's some of the most valuable money we've ever spent, and it really isn't even that much money. So definitely couldn't recommend highly enough taking a 2 or 3 month trip to some of your top destinations if you're able to do it.
Yeah. All right, got a few comments and questions here. Kaylee says, you guys are the best. I always learn so much. Thank you. Well, thanks for watching, Kaylee. We're super glad to hear that. Happy to help. I think we would be doing a disservice if we didn't share some of our knowledge and experience from over these years. And again, just want you guys to know that you can do it too. We really hope to inspire other people to be able to travel like we have, because it's such a unique opportunity to have that lifestyle flexibility of being a travel healthcare provider, to be able to travel the world too.
Another thing about international travel is it changes your perspective on everything. And we often talk about how we really wish that everyone in developed countries could do some travel to places that are less fortunate, because it really makes you appreciate everything you have. And it really makes you realize that a lot of the things that we think are problems are just so crazy to even complain about. Like, you see what other people deal with. They're humans just like you, and they deal with a lot more difficult situations. So if everyone could have that perspective, it would make the world a better place.
Yeah. All right, Rachel says, your trip looked absolutely amazing, and way to get back just in time before the awful flight cancellations. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, we got lucky with our flights.
We got really lucky. Sure. We actually had a cancellation and a delay, which made us miss a flight, which almost made us have to stay in Charlotte. Or no, it was Dallas, right? Or no?
Dallas.
No,
the delay in...
We almost had to stay in Charlotte until Christmas Day, but we got very lucky, got standby on a flight, and made it home.
Owen says, definitely go to Switzerland. I'll give you the beta when you're planning. Will this video be on the channel to watch after this? Yes, it will be. You can watch it anytime for the replay on Facebook or on the podcast. You can listen to it, or on YouTube as well.
Yep.
Let's see. Ali says, I was in Australia for an extended period, so I have dual SIM cards in my phone. Interesting.
Yeah, so something like that, if you're only going back and forth between 2 countries, that's the ideal thing to do. It makes a lot of sense. But if you're moving, say, 10 countries, it's really hard to get different SIMs for each place you're going.
And she said Google Fi also works really well for her for international travel. Definitely seems like the way to go. Okay, Kaylee wants to know, did you get a credit card and start saving points while you were PT students, or did you start once you had a paying job?
I actually started when I turned 18. I got my first couple credit card reward cards then, sign-up bonuses. But I did not really get into it until right as we graduated. And the main reason for that was because I didn't really have an income source. So each credit card application asks you, like, what is your annual income? And I didn't want to put 0 there because you're going to get declined for the card. So if you have some source of income, you can start getting at least the basic cards. It might not be like the premium top tier cards with the really great sign-up bonuses, but you can at least start building your credit even as a student. And there's actually specifically student cards that are available that will accept you with no income. So you can start as a student, but you really can't get really into it until you're making some sort of decent income.
Or you can try to get added as a
authorized user
on like one of your parents' credit cards, just to start helping build some of your credit.
Yeah, but that doesn't help you with points.
Yeah. Joel wants to know what the URL is for the travel insurance website. It's squaremouth.com. We'll type that in the link after the video. I'll leave it in the comments. Joel also wants to know, what's the weather/temperature like in Australia when you were there earlier this month? So it is there.
It depends on where you are.
Yeah, it's their summer when it's our winter. So we got there in like November. So it was more or less like their spring going right into their summer. Australia's a huge country. So like in the more southern part in Melbourne, that's further away from the equator, so it's more like being in the north here. It's a little cooler there. If you're in the north there, it's closer to the equator. Cairns is like
really
our
hot,
Florida,
really
basically
humid.
Really hot, really humid.
Yeah, so if you're in the middle of the country or the south this time of year, it's very comfortable. probably 60s, 70s.
Yeah,
maybe.
Sydney was really nice. It was like 60s, 70s.
Yeah, maybe low 80s. But if you're in the north, it's pretty uncomfortable. We wouldn't want to stay there for too long.
Okay, let's see if there's any other questions or comments.
And also, Joel, shout out to him. He's getting ready to start his own pretty long international trip. He sent me some questions a few weeks ago. So hopefully that trip goes well. Hopefully you're on the planning process and really excited right now.
Joel says, knowing what you know now, how far in advance do you book your flights and your hotels? So, it's tricky. So when we booked all of our stuff for our 2020 trip, we really got burned on that, and it all had to be canceled. Similarly, when we were in Latin America earlier this year for our 2-month trip, we got COVID, and we ended up having to quarantine and stay somewhere like a week longer than what we thought we were going to. So if we'd already had everything planned out, it would have really messed up our plans. So it's really tricky for sure.
And that's such a weird thing too. I was talking about that 2020 trip that just seemed like it wasn't going to happen. And earlier this year when we were starting that trip in Central and South America, we had not planned past Mexico City. And for whatever reason, it just felt like we should wait on that. And then we got COVID and ended up having to delay going to Guatemala anyway. So anyway, there's a lot of things that can happen. I would say the further you plan in advance, the cheaper it's going to be, but the more risky it's going to be. You never know what's going to happen. It is a little more certain now than it was 2020, 2021, even the beginning of 2022. Things seem to be getting more back to normal all around the world. I mean, Australia, New Zealand, completely back to normal. Most of the world's completely back to normal now. So you're not at risk of like a COVID outbreak canceling flights like you were back then. So I would say if you can book, probably 3 or 4 weeks in advance, that's probably when you still get some discounts instead of booking last minute. But then it's also close enough that you're not putting too many eggs in one basket in case something happens and you have to cancel it.
I would say if you can book your main international flight, like especially your beginning flight from the US to the country, pretty far in advance, but ideally if you can book with an airline that's flexible.
Yeah.
Like if there's some way that you can find an airline where you'll be able to cancel within a certain amount of time or at least change your flight, like in case it had to be pushed back or something, you're definitely going to get a better deal by booking a few months in advance. Now, beyond that, once you're already there, we don't necessarily feel like you have to have everything booked, but it just depends on if you're comfortable with booking on the fly. The other thing is, it kind of stinks like when you're on a trip and you're having to plan the next part of the trip, because now you might have to spend a whole afternoon of your trip planning the next part of your trip, and then you lose a day wherever you are because you're planning. So.
That's a really good point when you brought up. I didn't think much about that, but we've always done this in the past, and this is the first trip we didn't do it, and it was a major mistake. I would have your trip there and your trip back already booked before you leave. Yeah. Even if you don't have the stuff in the middle, just kind of have the beginning and ending point and a rough outline of what you're going to do, because it's hard to book international flights on dates that you need last minute, and we didn't realize how difficult that would be.
Especially around the holidays. This was the first time we ever tried to book something right around Christmas. It was a nightmare.
So, for example, what we did, I think in 2018 on that trip, we booked our first flight to the UK, and then we booked our flight home from, I think it was Bangkok or something like that. Whatever, we had all that booked well in advance. So the beginning flight, the ending flight, 5 months apart. We knew how we were going to get there and get back. We just needed to plan the middle, and I think that works out pretty well. I think it's
a good way to go. And hopefully if you work in some of that downtime in between, like we said, then it's not as big of a deal to spend a little bit of your time doing some planning. On this trip we had nothing planned. We just kind of planned it all as we went, and then like a week before we were supposed to go to Australia, we booked Australia, and then while we were in Australia, we booked New Zealand.
Yep.
So yeah, we kind of did it on the fly this time. Joel says he's about to start his 10-week vacation next week. Congratulations.
That's awesome. I think 10 weeks is like the ideal starting amount of time.
Yes, and he says, thanks for inspiring me to do this. We're so happy we could inspire you. I'm so glad you're going to get to do that. He says, I booked my round trip flight to the Philippines 7 months ago.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, definitely a good idea to have beginning and ending, and then the middle part you can figure out later.
Yep.
So
awesome. Again, if you guys could like this video, if you get any value from it, we appreciate it. This is a new record. I think we're at like 90 minutes, an hour and a half video.
So much to talk about.
When I looked at her outline, I knew it was going to take forever.
But hopefully this will be really helpful for those of you guys planning in the future. We get questions about this all the time, so we really hope that it was helpful.
Yep. And again, if you have any questions about anything we talked about, leave them in the comments here. We'll come back to the video in the future. and answer those.
Yep. Thanks for listening, and we're almost at the new year, so happy new
Almost
year,
at the
guys.
new year. Remember about the giveaways. We'll be doing a live video either on the 31st or the 1st, announcing all the winners to those, doing the drawing live, so that should be fun.
Yep. So, all right. Talk to you guys later.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye.